I found out my husband secretly wired my father's baby money to his mother's account when I saw a Pottery Barn delivery van pulling up to her house, a house she'd sworn she couldn't afford to furnish. My father had been saving that money for 31 years. He had never once touched it. That Tuesday morning I was standing in my own kitchen pouring my second cup of coffee, completely unaware that the life I'd been living was a performance staged entirely without my knowledge. But we'll get to that. We always do. A beginning is a strange thing to locate when you're looking back through wreckage. I think mine starts on a Thursday in late September, in a house that smelled like cinnamon and dish soap, where I was genuinely, unremarkably happy, the kind of happy you only recognize in hindsight, when you're trying to remember what it felt like before everything changed. My name is Claire Hartwell, and I had been married to Daniel Hartwell for 6 years. We lived in a craftsman bungalow in Raleigh, North Carolina, the kind of house with a deep front porch and original hardwood floors that creaked in specific spots I'd memorized like a map. The third step from the top on the staircase. The patch of floor directly in front of the kitchen sink. The strip between the living room and the hallway that Daniel always tried to avoid when he came home late, stepping wide over it in the dark like a boy trying not to wake his parents. I loved that about him, that he thought of that kind of thing, that he carried other people's comfort in his mind even in the small unconscious hours. I used to love it, anyway. That detail is important to hold on to, because it was precisely the kind of man he appeared to be, considerate, methodical, quietly caring, that made what he actually was so difficult to see until it was directly in front of me. I worked as a project coordinator at a mid-sized architecture firm downtown, and I liked my job more than I admitted to most people. There was something deeply satisfying about being the person who kept every thread from unraveling, who tracked the deadlines and managed the vendors and made sure the right samples arrived on the right desks at the right times. My boss, Patricia, a woman who wore exclusively linen and spoke in a register so calm it bordered on soporific, had told me twice in 3 years that I was indispensable. I kept both performance reviews in a folder in my desk drawer, not out of vanity but out of something I can only describe as the need for external confirmation that I was doing something right somewhere, that at least one part of my life was solid and verifiable and real. It occurs to me now, looking back, that I was probably keeping that folder as a counterweight to something I sensed but hadn't named, some unarticulated suspicion that the ground in other parts of my life was less stable than it appeared. Daniel was a financial analyst for a regional investment firm, and he was good at his job in the quiet, methodical way that people who are very good at something often are, without theatrics, without the need to explain themselves or perform their expertise for an audience. He kept color-coded spreadsheets on his personal laptop that he updated on Sunday evenings while I read on the couch beside him, and he had the habit of pressing his lips together in a flat, almost disapproving line when he was concentrating, which you only understood was concentration and not judgment once you knew him well enough to read the difference. We had been good together, and I want to be precise about that, not performed good, not Instagram good, not the kind of good that requires an audience to sustain itself. Actually, quietly, genuinely good in the way of two people who have built something real together and know it and don't feel the need to announce it. We cooked dinner on Tuesdays. We argued about where to put the couch and settled it by measuring the room with a tape measure like two ridiculous adults who loved each other. We had a joint savings account we'd been building for 3 years toward a down payment on something bigger, something with a yard, something we had a Pinterest board for that neither of us ever mentioned to friends because we knew how it looked, how earnest and domestic and unguarded, and we didn't mind being those things in private. My father, Raymond Beaumont, was 63 and retired from 40 years in railroad administration. He lived 40 minutes north of us in a modest split level that he'd shared with my mother until she passed 8 years prior, and he was not a man who showed emotion easily or often. He wore flannel shirts in every season except the dead of summer, drank black coffee from a thermos he'd had since 1997, and communicated affection almost exclusively through acts of service, fixing your car without being asked, dropping groceries at your door, calling on a Tuesday for no reason other than to hear how you were and then denying that was why he'd called. When my mother died, he spent 6 months barely speaking, and then one morning he simply got up and started volunteering at the food bank, and that was that. grief processed and redirected with the same quiet efficiency he applied to everything. He had never remarried. He had never, as far as I knew, been seriously interested in anyone else. I once found my mother's reading glasses in the top drawer of his nightstand when I was helping him look for his passport, and I'd pretended not to notice them there, because some things belong only to the person who keeps them. The baby money, and I should explain this, because the phrase sounds strange to people who weren't raised in certain Southern families, was a tradition my parents had started before I was born. When my mother was pregnant with me, my father opened a separate savings account and began depositing a small amount every month. Not much at first, $40, then $60, but consistently, without fail, across 3 decades and 2 interest rate crashes and my parents' retirement and my mother's illness and every other thing that life delivered to their doorstep. He told me about it when I turned 25, showed me the account balance across a kitchen table on a Sunday morning while we ate biscuits, and the number was enough to make me put down my fork and look at him without speaking for a moment. He said simply, "It's for when you need it most, a baby, or a house, or starting over. Whatever comes first." He had never touched it. Not when the water heater failed, not when the car needed a new transmission, not when he went 3 months between the railroad pension and Social Security finally kicking in. He had made the decision, every single month for 31 years, to leave it exactly where it was. I want you to understand what that money represented, because it matters more than the number. It wasn't a figure on a screen. It was 31 years of my father deciding, over and over again, that his daughter mattered more than whatever else he might have needed in that moment. It was every $40 deposit made when $40 was something he didn't have easily to spare. It was the one remaining thing my mother had been part of. She had been the one to suggest it, apparently, lying in bed next to my father in her second trimester, telling him that she wanted their child to always have a soft place to land. He had agreed, and had opened the account the following week, and had kept it going for 31 years after she was gone. That is what the money was. That is what Sandra Hartwell spent on a sectional sofa and matching side tables from Pottery Barn. The morning I need to start it was a Thursday, and nothing about it announced itself as the before of anything. I was at my kitchen counter eating yogurt with granola and half reading a budget report on my tablet while Daniel stood at the stove making eggs. He'd taken the day off, which was unusual but not alarming. He'd mentioned something vague about vacation hours he needed to burn before the end of the fiscal year. He was in gray sweatpants and a worn college t-shirt, spatula in hand, and there was enough early sunlight coming through the kitchen window that the room looked genuinely golden, the kind of warm ordinary light that feels, in memory, like a lie the morning was telling you. That's the detail that comes back to haunt you, I found. Not the terrible moment itself but the beautiful, unremarkable moment just before it. "Mom called last night," Daniel said, without turning around from the stove. His mother, Sandra Hartwell, called often enough that the statement itself registered as background noise, just another update in the ongoing low-level frequency of Sandra's presence in our lives, which I'd been managing with what I considered considerable grace for 6 years. She was not a bad person, and I want to be careful about how I characterize her because the story is complicated enough without flattening anyone in it. She was a woman of 61 who had retired early from a career in office management and had redirected her considerable organizational energy toward the project of her own family, specifically her son, and even more specifically toward the management of her son's relationship with his wife. She was the kind of woman who communicated her feelings primarily through implication and orchestrated helplessness, who said things like "I don't want to be a burden" in tones that made it perfectly clear she expected to be treated as the opposite, and who had perfected, over decades, the art of making her preferences feel like everyone's idea. I had been navigating this for 6 years with what I genuinely believed was sufficient grace, sufficient patience, sufficient understanding of the dynamics at play. I was wrong about what sufficient looked like. What did she want? I asked, looking up from the budget report. Daniel was pressing the spatula down onto the eggs in the way he'd always done, a habit I'd always privately thought was counterproductive and had never mentioned because some hills are not worth dying on. "Just catching up," he said, with the specific airiness of someone who has prepared the casual version of what they need to say. She's been talking about the living room again. Getting new furniture, her couch is pretty old. I made a non-committal sound and looked back at my tablet, because I genuinely had a report to finish and because the topic of Sandra's living room was a topic I had spent the better part of a year skillfully steering around. She mentioned she might need some help, Daniel added. Financially. That made me look up again. How much help? I asked. We'll talk about it later, he said. It's not urgent. I looked at the back of his head for a moment, the dark hair with its first threads of gray at the temples, the familiar set of his shoulders, and then I went back to my report. It was a masterclass in deflection, I now understand, vague enough to dismiss, specific enough to plant a seed. But I was tired, and I had a deadline, and I wasn't paying the right kind of attention. I stepped over the breadcrumb without looking down. Sandra had been making pointed observations about her living room furniture for at least a year, and the renovation she'd been describing in escalating detail was not a modest project. She'd sent me a Pinterest board for it once, after Sunday dinner, sliding her phone across the table with an expression of guileless enthusiasm that I'd received with a neutral smile and a quiet internal calculation. New sectional from Pottery Barn, 2000, conservatively. Coffee table, 500. Armchair and side table, 800 more. Lamps, 200 or 300. That was $4,000 at the low end, and Sandra had not been pinning things from the low end. She'd mentioned the project at least 3 times over the previous 2 months, always with the same closing note of resigned impossibility. She couldn't quite make the numbers work, she'd have to be patient, maybe wait until after Christmas. And every time I had nodded sympathetically and internally marked the subject as managed, and moved on. I had gotten so efficient at managing Sandra-adjacent conversations that I could dismiss an entire discussion in the time it took to pour a glass of water. That efficiency, it turned out, had not been protecting me. It had been protecting everyone else. What I didn't know, what I could not have conceived of, sitting at my kitchen counter that Thursday morning eating yogurt in the golden light, was that 2 weeks earlier, while I'd been in Charlotte at a 3-day conference, Daniel had transferred $24,000 out of my father's savings account into his mother's checking account. He had done this through a professional banking portal that he had access to through his work, a back-end transfer system used legitimately in estate management and fiduciary administration, and he had used it to move my father's money in the time it probably took him to drink a cup of coffee. He had come home from work that evening and asked how my meetings were going, and he had made dinner, and he had slept in our bed, and he had done this for the following 3 weeks without saying a word. That is the shape of the thing I was living inside without knowing it, on a Thursday morning in late September, eating yogurt and reading a budget report while the man I'd married made eggs at our stove. The how of it requires a specific explanation, because the how is important to understanding the full scale of what was done. 6 months before this, during a weekend visit, my father had mentioned the account to Daniel over dinner, offhandedly, the way older men sometimes talk about money in front of their sons-in-law, as an act of inclusion, of trust, of welcoming someone into the practical details of family life. He'd been in the middle of telling us he'd decided to move the account from a basic savings to a higher yield option and wanted Daniel's professional opinion on the best approach. He'd trusted Daniel enough to mention the account number, to ask for his expertise, to treat him like a man who had earned the right to know the details. Daniel had said he'd look into the best options for higher yield transfers. My father had thanked him and we'd finished dinner and done the dishes and watched baseball and gone to bed, and the evening had felt like exactly what it appeared to be, an ordinary, comfortable Sunday with family. 6 months later, Daniel had used that account number and his professional portal access to initiate the transfer. He hadn't forged anything. He hadn't needed to. He had simply used the information my father had given him in good faith, and the technical access his career had given him, and combined them into something that would take a federal fraud investigation to fully unravel. The furniture van appeared on a Wednesday morning in October, 3 weeks after that Thursday breakfast, and I only knew it had because I happened to be driving past Sanders Street on the way back from a project site visit. I wasn't going to her house, I had no reason to be on her street at all, but the site I'd been visiting was close enough that her block was a reasonable cut-through, and I'd taken it automatically, the way you take familiar routes without thinking about them. The van was cream-colored, a Pottery Barn delivery van, and two men in matching uniforms were carrying something large and wrapped in moving blankets up Sandra's front walk. I slowed without making a conscious decision to do so. Sandra had been talking about new furniture for months. That part wasn't strange. What was strange was that 3 weeks ago, at Sunday dinner, she had been pressing her lips together with resigned sorrow and saying she couldn't quite make the numbers work, that she'd have to be patient, maybe wait until after Christmas. And now there was a Pottery Barn delivery van at her house, and not one piece coming off it, multiple pieces, based on the second trip the two men were making back to the truck before I'd even finished processing the first. I pulled over 2 houses down and sat there with the engine running and a feeling beginning in the back of my chest that wasn't quite a thought yet, more like the outline of one, like seeing a shape in fog before you can name what it is. I told myself reasonable things. I told myself she'd found the money somewhere, sold something, got a better deal than expected, had a friend help her, dipped into a small account she hadn't mentioned. I told myself a number of very sensible explanations while I watched the men carry what was clearly a large sectional, still wrapped, still strapped, unmistakably large and new, through Sandra's front door. Then I put the car in drive and went home, and for the rest of that afternoon I moved through work and emails and a phone call with a vendor with a low, persistent unease sitting beneath everything like static under a radio signal, there but not quite loud enough to name, not yet. That night, after dinner, pasta with a Jared sauce neither of us was enthusiastic about. Daniel was at his laptop at the dining room table doing his Sunday evening work, and I was at the sink doing the dishes, and I asked, in the most carefully casual voice I could produce, how his mother was doing. "Good," he said. "She's good." I kept my hands in the warm soapy water and dried a plate and said, "Did she ever figure out the furniture situation?" Another pause, small, maybe half a second longer than natural, the kind of pause that you'd never catch if you weren't already listening for it, if some animal part of you wasn't already on alert and taking measurements. "She found a way to make it work," he said. I dried the next plate. "A sale?" I asked. "Something like that," he said. The dishcloth moved over the plate in slow, deliberate circles. Something in my chest had gone tight and still, the way a wire goes tight when it's being wound, not painful yet, just taut, just present, just there. I put the plate away and didn't say anything else. I had no proof. I had a furniture van, a long pause, and an answer that meant nothing and everything at the same time. I thought many times about what would have happened if I'd pushed harder that night. If I'd turned from the sink and looked at him directly and said, "What does that mean?" something like that. If I'd sat down across from him and asked him plainly and waited in the specific way that makes plainness impossible to evade. But I didn't, and not only because I had no proof, I didn't because some part of me already understood, at a level below conscious thought, that the answer was going to be something I couldn't put back once I'd heard it. There is a specific kind of hesitation that isn't cowardice. It's more like standing at the edge of a diving board, knowing the water is cold, knowing you're going to go in regardless, and taking one last second to exist in the world before the cold hits. I was standing at that edge. I stepped back from it. For one more night. The account statement arrived as a physical letter, because my father still received paper statements on all his accounts, a habit from before internet banking that he'd never seen reason to abandon. He paid for the stamp, received the paper, trusted the system. It was a Tuesday morning about 4 days after I'd seen the delivery van, and he called me at 9:15 while I was at my desk with something open in front of me that I immediately stopped seeing the moment I heard his voice. I almost didn't pick up. I was in the middle of something. I almost let it go to voicemail, and I have thought about that almost so many times that it has become almost meaningless through repetition, a word worn smooth from handling. "Claire," he said, when I answered. His voice sounded different from its usual register, measured in a way that was distinctly, specifically different from his ordinary measured, like a man holding a very large, very heavy thing very carefully, trying not to let it tilt. "I need you to look at something with me." "What is it, Dad?" I asked. My pen was still in my hand. I looked at the budget report on my desk without seeing it, some part of me already tracking the specific quality of his voice, already beginning the slow calculation of what that quality meant. My account statement came, he said. For the savings account. The one I told you about. Something happened in my chest at those words, a slow, hot drop, like an ember falling. Not panic. Not yet. Just a falling, a small interior drop that landed somewhere and burned quietly. Okay, I said, and the word cost me something I couldn't name. There's a transfer on here, he said, carefully, slowly, the way you say something you've been turning over in your mind for hours already. From 3 weeks ago. For $24,000. A pause that lasted long enough for me to count 3 full seconds. I didn't make any transfer, Claire. I don't remember standing up from my desk. I remember being at my desk, and then I was in the hallway outside my office with the door pulled most of the way shut behind me, my back against the wall and the fluorescent light above me humming its one flat note. My left hand was pressed palm flat against the cool smoothness of the drywall. The hallway smelled like printer toner and the ghost of a coffee spill near the printer station that someone had wiped but never fully cleaned, a smell so specific and ordinary that it would become, afterward, permanently associated in my memory with the moment the world reorganized itself. Every sensory detail was very sharp and very still, the way things get when your body understands something before your mind catches up to it. What's the account number on the statement? I asked. My voice sounded like a careful impression of my own voice, too even, too controlled, something reconstructed rather than natural. He read the number out to me. It was his account. There was no mistake, no alternative reading, no version of this that needed further verification. And the transfer, I said, does it say where it went? My father was quiet for a moment, the quiet of a man who has already been to the bank that morning, who already knows the answer, who is measuring how to deliver it. I took it to the bank when it opened, he said. Asked them to trace it. It went to a checking account held by a Sandra Hartwell. The hallway held absolutely still. The fluorescent light continued its flat, indifferent hum. Somewhere in an office behind me a phone rang and was answered with a professional greeting. I pressed my palm harder against the wall and breathed and thought about the delivery van and Daniel's half-second pause and the words something like that and my father's 31 years of $40 deposits and all the things I had chosen not to press on 4 nights ago. Everything was connecting, the way lines connect into a shape you couldn't see until the last one is drawn, and the shape was large and clear and completely, irrevocably real. Okay, Dad, I said finally. And then, because he needed to hear it even if it cost me something to say, I'm going to find out exactly what happened. And I'm going to fix it. I promise you. I went back to my desk and told Patricia I had a family emergency, and she looked at my face with the particular attention of a woman who has been reading rooms for 30 years and said, of course, go, without asking anything further. I went to the parking garage and got into my car and sat with my hands on the steering wheel looking at a gray concrete pillar for 11 minutes. I know it was 11 minutes because I looked at the clock when I sat down and again when I started the engine, and the gap between those 2 moments was 11 minutes of sitting with my hands exactly at 10 and 2, looking at the chipped paint stripe on the pillar, doing the thing that I was learning I was capable of doing under pressure, not falling apart, but processing. Taking the shape that had been forming in the fog and letting it fully materialize, looking at it clearly. Understanding what it was without flinching. My husband had transferred $24,000 from my father's savings account to his mother's checking account, using professional credentials and technical access he'd obtained through his career, without my knowledge, without my father's knowledge, without anyone's knowledge or consent. He had done this while I was at a conference in Charlotte. He had come home from that day and made dinner and asked how my meetings were going and had said nothing about any of it. For 3 weeks. Every morning coffee, every Tuesday pasta dinner, every Sunday evening at the laptop, 3 weeks of ordinary life laid over an act of profound, calculated betrayal, like wallpaper over a crack in the foundation. The cold that went through me in that parking garage was unlike anything I'd felt before, and I want to be specific about it because it matters. It wasn't the cold of being frightened. It was the cold of understanding. Of looking at 6 years and feeling them recalculate, like a spreadsheet where one wrong variable propagates backward through every formula, changing every number, calling every result into question. All the Sunday evenings. All the Tuesday dinners. All the conversations about the house we'd buy with the yard we'd planned, the joint Pinterest board we never mentioned to anyone. All of it was rearranging itself around a new and terrible center, and underneath it was a question I couldn't answer yet but couldn't stop forming. Was this the first time? Was there more? How long had he been capable of this, and had I been living inside it without knowing, the way you can live inside a lie someone else is telling without ever hearing the lie yourself? I didn't call him. That surprised me. I'd half expected the first thing I'd do would be to call him immediately, to demand an explanation, to break through the 3 weeks of silence with one direct question and see what fell out. But I didn't, and the reason wasn't fear. It was something that felt more like the cold professional calculation of a woman who had just been reminded that she was married to a financial analyst who had managed to run a fraud for God knows how long without anyone noticing. I needed to know what I was walking into before I walked into it. I started the car and drove to the bank. Our bank, mine and Daniel's, the one with the joint checking and the shared down payment savings. I went in and I asked to see all account activity across all accounts associated with my name for the past 90 days, and I sat across from an account manager named Greg, young, blue tie, 8 months in the job if I had to guess, and watched him pull up the statements on his screen with the cautious efficiency of someone who could tell this was not a routine request. There it was in the joint account, 2 days before my Charlotte conference, a transfer of $1,200 described as household management. Daniel had told me this was for a car repair. I had never asked to see the receipt, because I had trusted him, because he was my husband and financial analysts don't generally need to be audited by their wives, and I had been operating under the assumption that trust was a reasonable default in a marriage. And there, 3 weeks ago, a charge of $340 at a restaurant I'd never been to on a night Daniel had told me he was working late. These were not $24,000. They were smaller things, different in nature, the kind of things that could have explanations, that I'd have wanted to hear before drawing conclusions, things I couldn't yet be certain about. But they were there, in the record, and their being there meant that the $24,000 might not be the beginning of the story. It might be the moment the story became impossible to hide. I asked Greg if the bank's fraud department could help me understand the mechanics of an unauthorized transfer from an account belonging to a family member. He made a quiet call, and 20 minutes later I was sitting across from a woman named Denise, gray hair cut short, reading glasses on a beaded chain, the specific manner of someone who has seen every configuration of this situation and been surprised by precisely none of them. Denise pulled up the records on her screen, studied them with the slight, professional compression of lips that meant she was confirming rather than discovering, and then looked at me over her reading glasses. The transfer was initiated through a professional banking portal, she said. It was processed legitimately, meaning whoever did this had access to the originating account information and used valid professional credentials. This is what we classify as authorized push payment fraud when it's perpetrated by an insider. The account holder will need to file a formal fraud complaint, and there are recovery processes, but they take time. She paused. Because the funds have already been disbursed to the receiving account, recovery depends significantly on whether those funds are still accessible there. I thought about the delivery van, the multiple trips from truck to front door, the new sectional and the armchair and the coffee table and all the rest of it. They may already be spent, I said. Denise looked at me with something that was not quite sympathy and not quite clinical distance but lived carefully in the space between. Then recovery becomes considerably more complicated, she said. I drove to Sandra's house directly from the bank, because I needed to hear it from her and I needed to hear it before Daniel had the chance to reach her first. The 25-minute drive took me 20. The October evening had gone that particular shade of blue that happens in the Carolinas in early fall, cool and clear, leaves skittering across the road in my headlights, the kind of evening that under any other circumstance would have felt like a gift. I noticed it only the way you notice things when you're operating below your own feelings, as a piece of information, present but unprocessed. Sandra's living room light was on when I pulled into her driveway. Through the front curtains I could see the silhouette of something new and large, the high curved back of a sectional sofa, distinct even in shadow. I sat in the car for 30 seconds, hands in my lap, looking at that shadow. Then I got out and walked to her front door and knocked. She answered in about 30 seconds, wearing a soft cardigan with a glass of wine in one hand, and her expression when she saw me was a layered thing I now had the eyes to read. Surprise first, genuine, the kind that can't quite be faked. Then something else, something I recognized as the specific look of a woman who has been half expecting this and has a prepared position. She made my name warm when she said it, Claire. She stepped back to let me in, and the warmth of it was practiced in the way of someone who has deployed warmth as a management tool for so long that it has become indistinguishable from the real thing, except in the moments when it can't quite cover what's underneath it. The living room was transformed. New sectional in gray plush, enormous and perfectly placed, facing a new coffee table in blonde wood. New cream armchair in the corner with a throw pillow that matched the new curtains, which were also new. I registered, cataloging everything with a precision I didn't know I had in me at that moment. New side tables. New lamps. The full room, exactly as she'd pinned it on the board she'd slid across our dinner table with guileless enthusiasm. I stood in the center of it and looked at all of it. It looks beautiful, I said. And I meant it in the specific way you mean something when you are observing it from entirely outside your own feelings, when the thing in front of you is beautiful and also evidence of something that will take a federal fraud investigation to fully resolve, and both of those facts coexist without canceling each other out. Sandra settled into the new armchair with the practiced ease of someone who had already been sitting in it for 3 weeks. I finally got it done, she said, and her voice had the specific warmth of satisfaction. I love how it all came together. Come, sit, Sandra. My voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. It had the particular quality of a voice that has shed everything decorative and is operating at its functional minimum. I know where the money came from. The armchair held still. Her wine glass did not move. She looked at me, and the look was steady and watchful in the way of someone who has been waiting for a specific door to open and has decided exactly how they will walk through it when it does. I looked back at her and waited. I know that Daniel transferred $24,000 from my father's savings account, I said. And I know that you knew where it came from. I need you to tell me your version of how this happened, not Daniel's, yours. She took a deliberate sip of wine, set the glass on the new coffee table with a precision that looked like composure but was actually buying time, and then said, in a voice that was sorrowful and modulated and careful, Claire, I know this is upsetting. I know how this must look to you. I asked you how it happened, I said. Not how it looks. Something shifted in her face, the door closing by half, the warmth replaced by something more guarded and more honest. I needed help, she said. I've been struggling for a while. You know how far my pension goes, how much I manage on my own. I mentioned to Daniel that I wanted to do something about this room and he said he could help. That's all. He said he could help. She paused. He's my son. I trust my son. Did you ask him where the money was coming from? I said. The pause that followed was long enough to be its own answer, and then, he mentioned your family had savings set aside, she said. I understood it was family money. And family helps family. Family helps family. 6 years of that sentence, deployed at varying moments in varying tones, and every single time it had meant the same thing. Give me what I'm asking for, and if you don't, it means you're not real family. I looked at Sandra Hartwell sitting in her new armchair surrounded by her new furniture in her beautifully renovated living room, and I thought about my father's thermos from 1997 and $40 deposits and my mother lying in bed in her second trimester talking about a soft place to land. My father has been saving that money since before I was born, I said, with the quietness of something that doesn't need volume to land. He saved it through my mother's illness and her death. He saved it when he was between pensions for 3 months and it would have been easy to touch it. He kept it for 31 years because my mother came up with the idea and he couldn't let go of it, and he kept it for me. I paused. And you spent it on a couch. Sandra's chin came up. Her expression closed like a shutter being drawn. I think that's a very dramatic characterization, she said, and now her voice had shifted register entirely, harder, clipped, the warmth stripped back to reveal the steel beneath. Daniel made a decision and yes, it should have been discussed, but it was meant as a loan, it will be paid back, and I really don't appreciate being made to feel like a criminal in my own home for something that was meant to be. Stop, I said. Just the word. Just that one flat, quiet word, and something in its quality made her stop. My father is filing a fraud complaint with the bank, I said. The transfer was made without authorization through a professional banking portal, which makes it a federal matter. Daniel's firm has an ethics and compliance division. I'll be contacting them tomorrow. And I have an appointment with a lawyer. I let that sit in the room for a moment, alongside the new lamps and the new coffee table and all the rest of it. I want you to understand that these are not threats. These are the things that are going to happen. Sandra stared at me, and for the first time in 6 years of Sunday dinners and careful management and performed warmth, she had nothing ready. Her wine glass sat on the new coffee table. The new lamps cast their warm amber light across everything she'd bought with my father's money, and she sat in the center of all of it, and she had nothing. You wouldn't, she said finally, with less certainty than she'd intended. Try me, I said. I walked to the front door. Behind me I heard the creak of the armchair as she stood. Claire. Her voice had changed again, and this change was different from the others, not warmth, not hardness, not dignity. Just small. Just a woman who had looked at the full consequence of what had been done and found it larger than she'd expected. Most of the money is gone, she said. The furniture, installation, there were some other bills I'd fallen behind on, I can't give it back. I don't have it. I opened the front door. The October night came in cool and clear around me. I know, I said, and walked out into it. I drove to my father's house instead of home. It was after 8 by the time I got there, and he'd left the porch light on, which meant he'd been expecting me. He let me in without words and put the kettle on, not coffee, which surprised me, and which I think was deliberate, a choice not to caffeinate a night that already had too much electricity in it, and we sat at the kitchen table, the same table where he'd shown me the account balance when I was 25, and I told him everything. Not the carefully managed version I'd have given him 6 months ago, when I still had things to protect and distances to maintain. All of it, the banking portal, Daniel's professional credentials, the 2-year pattern I suspected, the restaurant charge, the car repair that probably wasn't, the whole shape of what I was looking at. He listened without interrupting. He refilled both cups. He listened some more, and his face throughout was not the face of a man receiving devastating news but of a man confirming something he'd already begun to understand on the drive home from the bank that morning, something he'd been sitting with all day, turning it over in the way he turned everything over, quietly, thoroughly, without drama. When I finished, he turned his mug in a slow circle on the table and said, "What do you need?" "I need you to file the fraud complaint," I said. "Tomorrow at the bank, as early as they open. And I need your permission to give your information to a lawyer I'm going to call in the morning." He nodded once. "Done," he said. "I'm sorry, Dad," I said, and the words cost me something physical, a tightness in the throat and behind the eyes that I was not going to let become tears tonight because if I started I wouldn't stop, and tonight was not the night for it. He looked at me across the kitchen table with the level, unsentimental gaze that I had known all my life. "I'm not sorry for you," he said. "You didn't do anything wrong. I'm sorry you married someone who did." We stayed up until nearly midnight. He made scrambled eggs at some point, the sharp cheddar kind, and we ate them at the table and talked about practical things, the complaint process, what Elise Marks, the lawyer a colleague had recommended 2 years ago, might be able to do, the timeline of what would need to happen in what order. He told me about my grandmother, who I hadn't thought about in years, and said she would have handled something like this with a specific brand of terrifying composure that I apparently had inherited, and it was the closest to a compliment he ever came. I slept in my old room, in the twin bed with the blue quilt, and stared at the ceiling for a long time in the dark, listening to the particular quiet of his house, the settling of the foundation, the hum of the furnace, and thinking about tomorrow with the focus of a woman who has crossed over from the feeling part of a crisis into the doing part of it. In the morning I felt different. Not healed, not resolved, not better in the ordinary sense of the word, just different, the way you feel different on the other side of something you'd been dreading, when the thing you feared has arrived and turned out to be survivable. Something that had been wound too tight had been permitted to simply stop. I borrowed a charger from my father and sat at his kitchen table with my first coffee and my phone and made a list, not an emotional list, not a grief inventory, but a logistical one, the kind I made for project timelines at work, steps, actions, in order, with dependencies noted. The first call was to Elise Marks. I had her number filed in my phone under a contact name I'd made deliberately mundane, EM Dry Cleaning, in the way you save the number for a locksmith before you've ever been locked out, some part of you acknowledging the possibility of need without wanting to name it. She answered on the second ring. I explained the situation in the ordered, factual way I'd organized it in my head overnight, and when I finished there was a brief silence, and she said, "Can you come in today?" And I said yes. Her office was on the 9th floor of a downtown building with a waiting room that had the specific hush of a place where serious things happen with professional composure. I sat in a leather chair and looked at a ficus tree in a large pot and thought about nothing, which was something I'd recently discovered I was capable of when the alternative was thinking about everything at once. Elise Marks was about 50, with short gray-streaked hair and a stillness in her that made you want to be precise when you spoke, because you could see her processing everything you said and you didn't want to give her imprecise material to work with. She listened to the full account with her hands folded on her desk, made occasional notes, and when I finished she uncapped her pen and began writing with more purpose. "The unauthorized banking transfer is a criminal matter, separate from anything civil," she said. "Your father's fraud complaint will initiate an investigation, and given the amounts and the method, a professional banking portal, this will likely be referred to federal authorities. Your husband's professional credentials are directly relevant, because they mean the crime was facilitated by access he obtained through his career, which is an aggravating factor." She paused and looked at me levelly. "Are you planning to file for divorce?" The word sat in the air between us. I'd been turning it over for 12 hours without letting myself name it fully, and hearing it named out loud was like a key entering a lock, a click, an alignment, a mechanism engaging. "Yes," I said. "Good," she said, with a brisk nod that contained no judgment whatsoever. "Then we also have the marital asset picture to protect. Your joint savings account, is that currently accessible to both of you?" "Yes," I said. "Then I'd recommend we move quickly on a financial protection order before he has the opportunity to move any of those funds. I can initiate that today." I thought about Daniel's color-coded spreadsheets, about a man meticulous enough to navigate a professional banking portal at 9 in the morning and come home for dinner without a tremor. "Do it," I said. She was already writing. I went back to the house that afternoon. Daniel's car wasn't there, coincidence or warning, I didn't know, and it didn't matter either way, because I was glad for the empty driveway and the 2 hours of uninterrupted time it gave me. I went to the filing cabinet in the home office and photographed, with my phone, every financial document in it, tax returns going back 4 years, account statements, insurance documents, the mortgage paperwork, the records of our joint savings contributions going back to when we'd opened the account. I emailed everything to Elise's office in 3 batches. Then I went to the bedroom closet and took out the overnight bag I'd had since college, a battered canvas duffel that had been on every trip I'd taken before Daniel and remained in the back of the closet through 6 years of our life together, and I packed it with the things I'd need for an indefinite stay at my father's. 3 days of clothes, my laptop, chargers, my toiletry bag. My grandmother's ring, which lived in a velvet box in my top bureau drawer and which was mine entirely, a bequest from my father's mother, predating Daniel, predating our marriage, belonging to no version of my life that included him. I put the ring in the side pocket of the bag, then picked up the bag and carried it to the front door. Then I went back to the home office and sent Daniel a text from the desk where he'd kept his color-coded spreadsheets. "I've spoken to a lawyer. I'll be staying at my father's. Do not move any money from the joint accounts. I will know immediately if you do. I read it back once. I sent it. His response came while I was in the hallway, bag already over my shoulder. Claire, please, can we just talk? No punctuation, very unlike Daniel, who had always been meticulous about punctuation, for whom the absence of a period was the kind of imprecision he didn't permit himself. I stood in the hallway of the house we'd moved into together, with the hardwood floor that creaked in the specific spots I'd memorized, and the front door painted slate gray with a brush and a roller and a cheerful argument about which was better, and I put my phone in my purse and picked up my bag and walked out. I locked the door behind me with the muscle memory of 6 years. I didn't look back at it. I stopped at the coffee shop on the way to my father's and sat in a corner booth for an hour with a latte I didn't particularly taste. I'd sat in that same booth 8 months before Daniel and I bought the house, I remembered, on a first date that had gone 2 hours longer than I'd expected, until they'd started putting chairs on tables around us. That memory arrived and I looked at it and then I let it go, the way you put down something you've been carrying too long. I sat with the window in front of me and the October streetlights coming on in the early dark, and I let everything I'd been managing for 36 hours come up fully, the grief of it, the vertigo of understanding you don't know someone you thought you knew completely, the specific loss of a future you'd been building in good faith with someone who had not been building it in good faith back. The image of the Pinterest board for the craftsman house with a yard. The Tuesday pasta dinners. All of it, I let it come up and I looked at it without flinching and I didn't try to make it smaller than it was. Then I finished the latte, paid, and drove to my father's. He'd left the porch light on. Over the next 2 weeks things moved with the specific momentum of things put in motion by people who know what they're doing. Elise filed the financial protection order, which was granted, freezing our joint accounts pending the divorce proceedings. My father's fraud complaint moved through the bank's fraud department and was referred, as Elise had predicted, to federal investigators. Daniel retained his own attorney, a man named Morris, whose initial communication to us was a letter full of language that amounted to claiming the transfer had been made in good faith as an authorized loan arrangement between family members, which Elise described as creative and then set aside with efficient precision. The bank's internal compliance division, notified by the federal referral of Daniel's professional portal access, opened a parallel review. His firm's ethics department opened their own. 2 weeks in, he was suspended without pay pending further investigation, and I found out through Elise rather than through him, which was itself a kind of answer about where we were. Sandra called me 3 times in the first week. I didn't answer. On the 4th call, on a Thursday afternoon when I was at my father's kitchen table with a mug of coffee and a stack of financial documents Elise needed organized, I picked up. She sounded different from her usual self, older somehow, or maybe I was just hearing her without the filter of 6 years of managed distance. The practiced warmth was gone, or mostly gone, leaving something underneath it that I couldn't entirely read. "I think we need to talk," she said. "I think we all need to find a way through this that doesn't have to go where it's going." "There is only one direction this is going," I said, as calmly as I'd say anything. "Claire," she said, and the pause before my name held something in it, not an apology, not exactly, but the shape of one, the negative space where an apology would go if she had the full language for it. "I want to pay it back. I know it will take time, but I'm selling some things. Some of the furniture I think I can return. I've already called about the sectional." I thought about the delivery van in reverse. I thought about the 2 men in uniforms taking it back down the front walk wrapped in moving blankets, reversing the process exactly, restoring the flat-armed old couch to its original position. "Whatever you return, you send directly to my father's account," I said. "Not through Daniel. Not through a lawyer. Elise will give you the transfer information." "That's not a negotiation." She was quiet for a moment. "Okay," she said. And that was the end of it, not a resolution, not a reconciliation, just an acknowledgement that the terms had been stated and she understood them. It wasn't enough. I want to be clear about that. The furniture returns, whatever Sandra recovered from them, was not enough and would never be enough to fully restore what had been taken. The law is not always as complete as you'd want it to be. But there was a specific justice in the image of Sandra Hartwell standing in her living room making return phone calls, watching the delivery van come back for the sectional and the coffee table and the armchair, watching the room return to its honest state, the old couch with the flat armrests and the sagging center cushion, the 15-year-old reality of it. It was incomplete justice. But it was the only kind available, and I took it. The thing about a carefully constructed lie is that when it begins to come apart, it doesn't come apart neatly. It unravels in every direction at once, like a knitted thing when you pull the right thread. The federal fraud investigation, once underway, looked at the full scope of Daniel's personal finances. What they found was something Elise had suspected but I hadn't known. Over the same 2 years he'd been making small transfers to Sandra from his personal account. Daniel had also been supplementing that personal account through a pattern of manipulated expense reports at his firm, not enormous individual amounts, nothing that would trigger a single transaction audit, but consistent and systematic, across 30 months, amounting to slightly over $40,000 of corporate funds. Incorrectly expensed and quietly redirected. A second fraud, entirely separate from the first, different investigators, same defendant. I found out on a Tuesday morning when Elise called me, and I sat down on the edge of my father's couch and pressed my hand flat against my sternum and breathed, not because it shocked me, by then I was past the kind of shock that required recovery, but because of what the math meant. 2 years, $40,000 from the firm, $24,000 from my father. This was not a desperate man making one bad decision. This was a sustained, systematic campaign, running in parallel channels, maintained with the methodical precision of a man who color-coded his Sunday spreadsheets. The divorce proceedings were contentious in the specific way that proceedings are when one party has something to conceal and the other has a lawyer who is very good at finding concealed things. Daniel's attorney was creative. Elise was precise, and documentation is more powerful than creativity in a courtroom, which is what the proceedings eventually became. The criminal matters complicated the divorce timeline. Criminal proceedings have that effect, but they also simplified certain arguments about equitable distribution, because a man under federal investigation for financial fraud has limited grounds for claiming a fair share of assets acquired through or adjacent to that fraud. The criminal proceedings resolved first, and they resolved with a guilty plea on the expense report fraud charges in exchange for a reduced sentence and cooperation with investigators. The sentence, 2 years supervised probation, a substantial financial penalty, and permanent revocation of his banking and investment credentials. He would never again work in a role with fiduciary access to others' accounts. He would never again be the kind of financial analyst who could move money through a professional portal on a Tuesday morning. Everything the career had been, the expertise, the credentials, the quiet competence, stripped in a courtroom sentence that took about 45 seconds to read aloud. I was in the gallery when the sentence was read, with Elise on one side and my father on the other. My father wore a flannel shirt and sat very straight and held his thermos in both hands and said nothing. I watched Daniel stand at the defense table in a suit I recognized, one he'd worn to my firm's Christmas party 2 years ago, and hear the sentence read, and I watched his face during it, that flat, compressed line of his concentrated expression, which I'd spent 6 years reading as thoughtfulness and was now reading as what it actually was, the expression of a man processing the outcome of a calculation that had not gone in his favor. I felt many things during those 45 seconds. Grief was in there, somewhere, and something that wasn't quite satisfaction but lived in the same neighborhood, the feeling of a thing being named accurately, publicly, permanently. And underneath both of those, something quieter and more durable, the specific piece of having done what I'd said I would do. Of having found out. Of having fixed as much as fixing could reach. The divorce was finalized 7 months after my father's phone call. 7 months is a long time to be in the middle of something and no time at all to look back on, depending on what you're measuring. I signed the final documents in Elise's office on a Thursday afternoon in late May, with the windows open onto a street that smelled of cut grass and recent rain. Elise handed me my copy of the decree and I looked at it for a moment, the clean, formal language of legal endings, which has the effect of making the largest events of your life sound like administrative transactions. "How do you feel?" Elise asked, with the careful neutrality of a woman who has handed people many such documents. Like I can breathe, I said. She nodded. Good, she said. That's the correct feeling. I bought a small apartment 4 months after moving out of the Craftsman house. The down payment fund, the account Daniel and I had been building for 3 years, was awarded to me in the settlement, which was appropriate given that my salary had contributed the majority of it, a fact that Daniel's attorney had approached from several creative angles before documentation made the argument impossible to sustain. The apartment was smaller than I'd eventually want, but it was mine in a way that nothing had been mine for 6 years, solely, completely, without negotiation. I painted the living room a pale green that my mother had once described, in a memory I'd retrieved suddenly in the hardware store while standing in front of the paint chips, as the color of the inside of a stem. I painted it on a Saturday alone, with the windows open, and the color was exactly right when it dried. My grandmother's ring, which had been in its velvet box through the entire marriage, I moved to my right hand the day I got the keys to the apartment. Not a statement. Just a decision. I wanted to wear something real, something that had been mine before any of this and would be mine through everything that came after. It caught the light in the kitchen of the new apartment in the late afternoons, when I sat at the second-hand table I'd found at an estate sale and ate dinner alone, and I'd look at it sometimes and think of her, and of my father, and of my mother suggesting a savings account in her second trimester, and of the specific, continuous, unhurried way that some people love. My father visited on a Sunday in November, about a month after I'd moved in, arriving with his thermos and a bag from the bakery near his house, the one with the cheese Danish he'd been buying on Sundays since I was approximately 12 years old. We sat at my kitchen table with his coffee and the Danish, and he told me about the food bank and the man who'd donated 30 pounds of sweet potatoes all at once and the logistical problem it had created, describing it with the genuine satisfaction of a man who finds logistical challenges inherently interesting. He looked around the apartment while we talked, the green walls, the window with a good tree outside it, the bookshelf I'd assembled wrong twice and right the third time, the grandmother's ring on my right hand. He looked at all of it with the level, unsentimental attention he gave to everything, and then he said, "Good." Just the declarative word, the one that means this is what we have and we are going to be fine with it. "Dad," I said. He looked at me. "That account," I said. "Whatever's been recovered. I don't want it spent on me, not now. I want you to put it back somewhere safe and let it sit, for when you need it. Okay?" He turned his coffee mug in a slow circle on the table, the way he did when he was thinking something through. The November light came through the window in long, warm bars across the table. The tree outside still had some leaves, orange and persistent, the last ones clinging past their season, which I found quietly admirable. He looked at me for a long moment, doing considerable work behind a quiet face. "Your mother would have liked you very much," he said finally. "She'd have liked you at your worst and considerably more at your best." He picked up his coffee. "You're at your best." He didn't say okay, which was its own kind of answer, the kind that means he heard me, and he'll think about it in the private thorough way he thinks about everything, and he'll do what's right. Which was all I'd ever needed him to do. The last call from Sandra came on a Friday afternoon in January, 8 months after everything began. I was at my desk, back in the full rhythm of work, finishing the budget report that had been open on my screen on the morning I'd missed my father's first call and almost missed his second. Her name appeared on my screen and I looked at it for a moment, and then I picked up. She sounded changed in a way that was harder to define than just tired, like someone who'd been in a very cold room for a long time and still carried it in their voice. "I'm not calling to ask anything," she said. "I just needed you to know that I understand what I did. And I know I can't undo it." I said nothing. "I think about your mother," she said. "What you said. That she thought of that account when she was pregnant with you." The January sky outside my office window was white and still and impartial, knowing nothing about any of it. A pigeon had been sitting on the window ledge for the better part of an hour, completely indifferent to all human proceedings, which I found oddly companionable. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because I needed someone to know that I know," she said. There was a long quiet between us. Then I said, "Okay, Sandra." And that was the end of it. Not forgiveness, I wasn't there yet, and I wasn't sure the destination was forgiveness exactly. But an acknowledgement. A witnessing. Some things you acknowledge and carry forward, and that's as close as it gets, and maybe that's close enough. I put my phone down and went back to the budget report and finished it before end of day and sent it to Patricia. I packed up my bag and stopped at the coffee shop on my way to the parking garage, the same shop, the same corner booth, the same dark roast in a paper cup, and I sat with it for a few minutes before going to my car, watching the other customers come and go in the January cold, people with their own lives and their own private calculations, none of them knowing anything about any of mine. 8 months ago I'd sat in this booth and let everything come up and felt it without looking away. Now I sat and felt something that was quieter and more durable than anything I'd felt in that first session with myself, something that didn't need a name because it had become structural, part of the load-bearing material of who I was becoming. I reached into my bag for my keys and found instead a folded hardware store receipt, stem green, interior matte, 1 gallon, that had been in the bag since the day I'd painted the apartment. I looked at it for a moment. Then I put it back. Some records you keep without needing to explain why. I drove home through the January city with the heat on and the radio low, the streets doing their ordinary work around me, traffic lights and storefronts and people walking with their hands in their pockets against the cold. I turned onto my street and parked in front of my building and took the stairs to my floor and opened the door with my key, which was my key, for my apartment, whose walls I had painted the color of the inside of a stem. The green met me when I came in, calm and particular and chosen entirely by me, and the tree outside the window had its bare winter branches making a clean pattern against the white sky, and on the bathroom counter, where I'd left it this morning, my grandmother's ring was catching the last of the January light. I picked it up and put it on. I made tea. I sat at my kitchen table in the quiet, the real quiet, the one that doesn't ask anything of you, and thought about nothing in particular for a while, which was a thing I had become very good at, and which felt exactly like what it was, mine.